Thank you for coming. Let's just wait 1 minute for these gentlemen to sit down. Yeah, so we're going to talk about application logging and the GDPR. Before we start, let me read my disclaimer. I'm not a lawyer, I'm an engineer. I do not provide legal advice. This presentation shares our best practice, what we do in our company, and for secure logging, and while in compliance with GDPR. You should consult your lawyers for legal advice. So that's my disclaimer. So you already heard, I'm a security architect. I work on the security and privacy related topics for the past 15 years. Currently, I work for Thales, and as quite a few of you attended LOSCON before knows, I work for Gemoto. Gemoto has recently been acquired by Thales. So Gemoto still as a whole, as a bubble in Thales, and we're now called Thales DIS, Digital Identity and Security. And the business unit I'm working on is called Cloud Protection. So I'm the leader of the software security for the cloud protection, part. While I was I've been quite busy and traveling, and also a lot of work to do. So I was preparing my presentation on the flight last Friday as well. I was flying back to Austin. And the lady sitting next to me, she's been chatting with me, and she works in the environmental protection. And she just attended a big conference, and she's in the same flight. And then I started to prepare this presentation. She glanced over. She said, "Oh, you're going to give a talk about logging. Wow, so logging, are you working for a logging company?" And because this is, it's because she works on environmental protection, the word logging just very intriguing. And I said, no, I'm not cutting words. I'm working on this kind of logging. And then I came back home, because I heard about logging. I want to really see what is this, why we call it logging in the first place, right? And then you search, and then on dictionary, logging, log basically have two main meanings. The first meaning is basically recording. Like they use in early days in navigation on the ships, and they do logging. So the dictionary will say you log into logs, right? And so that's one part, and then it's the cutting tree part. But we're talking about this. We are dealing with a lot of logs, right? And we have application servers, we have applications, we have firewalls, and we have many kind of appliances and services, products. Everybody, all keeps logs, and there are different types of logs. We have audit logs. It's basically saying who has done what, when, and where. And we have error logs, which logs all the errors, the warnings, and the events. We have security logs that record security-related events. And for example, log in, log out, unauthorized access. And we also have, like, you may use mod security. It also records a variety of events. So among many purposes of logging, log data are invaluable for security, for detection, detect the incidents, and monitoring, for example, monitor the policy violations, and for diagnosis, and provide evidence for forensics, establish audit trails, and so on and so forth. And so many of these logs may contain personal data, and that's what we're concerned about. Okay, because of the importance of logs, OWASP actually have many tools or guidance. For example, the top 10 proactive controls. One of them is about secure logging. And we also know ASVS, the Application Security Verification Standard. It also have a section on logging. And we have Secure Logging Project. We have the OWASP logging cheat sheet. We have many references. And also other OWASP documents, for example, developer guide, testing guide, also have sections about logging. And of course, there are open source tools and commercial tools to manage logs. So we already have all these. Why are we still talking about logging? Why I'm even here, right? You probably will ask. So on the one hand, various businesses, they have different set of security requirements. For example, if you're dealing banking, or you are selling flowers, or you're a social media provider, different business have face different risks, and they have the different level. They have to provide may provide a different level of trust in their applications. So we need our developers in Thales. Developers often need more relevant security guidance. That's one aspect of it. And the other aspect is have you heard of GDPR? For those you don't know GDPR, raise your hand. Never heard of it? Okay. So most people have heard about GDPR, and there are some people who have not heard about it. So this is European's General Data Protection Regulation. So it has become a law since last year, May 25th, 2018. So it has great impact to a lot of companies. So then the developers have many questions. What do we have to do to be GDPR, GDPR compliant? So this regulation affects all products and services sold and used or operated in EU, in European Union, even if your services is not actually operating in European Union. You're operating in US, but you have users in European Union. You have to follow the law. Yes, because of this need, and we have done, for myself and also my colleagues, we have done a lot of many work in this area to provide security guidance for secure logging. And in this talk, I would like to share some of our best practices. So I assume most of you know about logging. I'm not going to talk into logging. What I'm more interested here is security logging. Is so we can see we have 3 bubbles here, and we have overlap between logging and the security. Not all logging is for security purpose, but some of logging is security logging is for security purpose. It's about what to log for for security, for forensics, for audit purposes. And then we have security logging, I just mentioned. We also have security of the logging. So regardless your logging is for security purpose or for other purpose, you want to make sure your logging practice and your logs are secure. So you want to protect your log streams. That's what we call security of the logging. So regardless what you log, and with logging and the security, security logging or non-security logging, they both, for both, you need to concern about data privacy. So, I think many of you have children, right? And so a young boy, the first day at school, this happens very often, right? The first day of the school, the teacher asks the children, come to the front, write down your name, what you like, but this little boy is more security conscious. And he said, before I write my name on the board, I need to know how you are planning to use that data. So the boy asked the right question, right? Why do you want me to write down my name? What's the purpose, right? The teacher can say, well, so everybody know your name and they can match the name with your face, right? The teacher do have a purpose. So collecting personal data must have a legitimate purpose. So yesterday, I was in the threat modeling workshop, and one of the gentlemen also sit here in this talk. And so the first part of this workshop is basically imagine a product that you want to threat modeling on, right? And so the instructor was saying, you know what you want to do, and then people saying smart scooter. So they said, okay, at the end they will build a smart scooter, and and then the next question is, what does a smart scooter do, right? Besides that a person can ride on the scooter going around Austin, right? So one person said, well, we can collect a lot of data about the rider, right? And I said, why? And I said, well, we can collect a lot of data. You know, just think about it. A person ride on the scooter, and you can collect the heart rate, right? It's a smart scooter. You can have sensor. You can heart rate. You can collect fingerprint or palm print. You can also have a little camera to collect the face picture, and you can collect locations. So you can collect a lot of data about this person. But what you really need to ask is why? What's the purpose of collecting this data, right? So I said, why? Right? The person said, well, we can collect this data for future use, right? For the lot of companies collecting this data. And another person said, oh, we can log everything, right? We can log, and then it's again the question I have is why, right? So, the question is, can you or should you collect the personal data just because of you can? So what is your purpose? And what are the risks of collecting this data? What might be the cost of collecting this data? So you need to think through instead of collecting as much data as you want and log as much data as you want, right? So now we get back to the data privacy law. And many countries have data privacy laws. So what is the best known privacy law in US? So every time you go to a every time you go to a doctor's office, what do you have to sign? Yeah. So that's the Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act, HIPAA. And when HIPAA in earlier years, right, and the assistant will give you a stack of paper and have you read it and sign at the back. Now, recently, I think in recent years, you go there and they let you sign a sheet of paper and then saying, I have read HIPAA. And once I asked, well, you never showed it to me. Why do you want me to sign it, right? So that's yeah. So many countries have regulations of law and or laws to protect people's privacy. So these laws protect personal data stored on computers or in organized paper filing system. So they both electronic or physical record. These laws define rules, what you have to do, in what condition you can collect the data. And define the rules the people, the employee, and the organizations have to follow. And also these rules are typically enforced by a government agency. So all these data privacy laws, they do not prevent organizations from collecting, storing, or using personal data, as long as you follow the rules. So these laws are rules you can still use, but you have to follow the rules. Okay, so now let's get back to the European Union's General Data Protection Regulation. We typically say GDPR. It's a law enabled since last year, May 25th, 2018. So there's central there's a regulation agencies in each of the European Union states which can monitor the implementation of these laws. So in recent years, since last year, there have been many fines, like for Facebook, for Google. That's a large amount. So the fines can go up to 4% of your company's revenue. So it's not the profit, 4% of the revenue, or 20 million euros, whichever is higher. Okay. So this is the most stringent privacy laws among over 110 privacy laws around the world. So in this talk, we're not going to go into details about this law, and it's many, many articles. I think it's 99 articles. And also, I'm not expert of GDPR. However, we're going to highlight some points that we believe that's relevant to application logging. That's the topic we'll talk about. And at the start of this regulation, at the very beginning, in the recital, and this GDPR, I'm going to read this. This is exact quote. The protection of natural persons in relation to the processing of personal data is a fundamental right. So this is their belief. Protection of personal data is a fundamental right, like speech, like just living. Okay, so it is very important. Now, what are personal data? What considered as personal data? It's any information relating to a natural person, directly or indirectly. As you can see, it's go beyond the traditional definition of personal data. So it does include the traditional ones, like names, phone numbers, locations, ID numbers. So those we typically considered as personal data. It also considers other information like racial or ethnic origin, the health data, your political opinions, your philosophical opinions, your your religion, your trade union membership. So these are all concerned as personal data. And you can see I have some reference, so I'll say GDPR Article 4.1. And I'm not in this talk, I'm not directly quote, but use layman's language trying to explain some of the concept. If you want to see details, and because it's a long regulation, I point to the article number so you can go to look by yourself. Another concept I want to point out is called data controller and the data processor. So the data controller determines the purpose and the means of processing of personal data in terms of collect, transmit, store, process, use, alter, etc. So the data controller determines why and how, okay? And then there's another entity is called data processor. The data processor process the personal data on behalf of the data controller. So as a company, you want to ask yourself, are we data controller or we are data processor? And in the regulation, it has rules for the data controller and for processor, okay? So as an example, as Gemalto, I still like to say Gemalto, or Thales DIS, now our name is Thales DIS. As a company, in general, we are data processor. Our customers, as you know, Gemalto's customer is basically the government, banks, telecom operators, enterprise, and companies, basically, organizations. So those, our customers, they are data controllers. We are data processors. We process data on their behalf. For example, the business unit I'm working in is for cloud protection. So we provide products and the services to protect identities and to protect data. So we're doing this on the behalf of our customers. We're data processors, okay? However, from the logging perspective, we're also data controllers because in order to provide, for example, data protection service, we need to do certain types of logging to provide the service, to provide the support, to provide the maintenance, importantly, to provide security. So from that aspect, we are data controllers because in order to provide service, we need to do logging. We need to log certain data. And we have the control to decide what to log, what not to log, okay? And so GDPR also talked about, listed some data protection principles. So we're going to go through the main ones. So personal data must be processed lawfully, fairly, and in transparent manner. So I think this is clear. So these points, almost all of them related to logging. Logging, if you log personal data, it's still considered as processing of personal data. The act of logging is considered processing. So the basic principle applies. The personal data shall be collected for specified, explicit, and legitimate purpose. And these data collected have to be adequate, relevant, and limited. you really want to minimize the personal data you collect, you log. You want to, this is called data minimization, okay? We'll see why later. And the data collected must be accurate, and as required, kept to up to date. So you'll see I grayed out part of it because, okay, accurate, whatever we log, it has to be accurate, right? And if you not logging, if your application need to store personal data, say store in your database, and this data has to be accurate and have to kept up to date, right? Because we're going to talk about, it's about the right of the individual. And if the individual say, okay, this has changed, they want to change, and for example, they have a new baby, right? And from the healthcare perspective, as before, the lady covers herself and her husband. Now have a new baby, now they will cover another baby. So the family situation has changed. You want to keep up to date. But with logging, this keep up to date does not apply because you don't suppose to change the log. We need to keep the integrity of the log. And retained, the personal data shall be retained as long as necessary, only as long as necessary. If you no longer need the data, the personal data has to be removed. And then importantly, the personal data shall be processed in the appropriate manner to maintain the security. So this is saying we have to protect the personal data you store or you record or in your logs. So in certain situations, you will have to get consent for collecting personal data, okay? So they have specific articles to talk about this, to talk about consent. And so for us, most of the time, because we're a data processor, the consent has already been done by the data controller. So mostly the consent is done by the data controller. We don't need to have additional consent, except in certain situations, which I'm going to talk about. So it's called special categories of personal data. And so this consent is managed by the data controller. Okay, I'm going to mention it a little bit later. So the rights of an individual is the subject can request to access the data you collected. For example, in HIPAA situation, it's very similar in this case to HIPAA. And if you read HIPAA, you can ask your health provider to see what they have recorded, okay? And the right to rectification, basically correction. And the next one is a right to be forgotten. So this is pretty new compared to the previous and other privacy laws. So if you remember, even a few years back, you create an account online, you will never be able to remove that account, right? And you can sign in, but you cannot forever sign out, right? So now with this law, the right to be forgotten is enforced. That for example, the service provider, they have to be able to allow you to disassociate yourself with the online service you signed before. And the right to portability is your data. You should be able to export your data and move it to another provider. For example, you use one storage service and you want to be able, let's see, you want to be able to take your data out and put into another another service. And right to object is if the personal data is collected for certain purpose, for example, marketing, and or for some other campaigns. And first of all, in this situation, you have to get individuals' consent, and the individuals, the person should have to have the right and the means to reject, do not allow to conduct. Okay. So now, in terms of logs, our developers ask many questions, and these are the most frequent questions. And what personal data should not be logged? Okay, because we all know GDPR is enforced. We went through the big exercise to go through all our applications to make sure we're GDPR compliant. And now, in terms of logging, what personal data should not be logged, and what personal data we can log. So these are the most frequently asked questions. So to answer that question, you have to ask yourself, what is the purpose that we collect personal data? Okay, so we normally call it a justification of need. So basically, that the data, your log data that we're talking about here, the data collected should be necessary to accomplish the purpose for which log data is generated. For example, you have to collect certain data to provide service, okay? To provide support of your service, or maintenance, or the security. So these are all legitimate need. In one of the Article 6, and talk about the processing. Let's see. So talk about Article 6. Talk about processing is lawful only if then there's a couple of conditions, right? And one of the conditions is basically saying processing of personal data, in our case, is logging, is lawful if it is necessary. It is necessary for the purpose of legitimate interest of the data controller. And then further in one they call it recital 49, that's from the security point of view that you can take a look. It says processing of personal data to the extent strictly necessary and proportionate for the purpose of ensuring network and information security. So this is considered as legitimate purpose. So given this, it's basically saying we can log certain personal data as long as it's for the legitimate purpose of the data controller. In our case, it is especially for the purpose to ensure network and information security. Okay. And we also, as we talked earlier, we want to minimize the personal data that we need to, we collected. So what should not be logged? Basically, you do not log sensitive personal data. From the GDPR perspective, it has a special category of personal data. So the special categories include the list above, except the last two. Okay, last two is Social Security is mainly for U.S. For some other countries, Social Security number is not a private data; it's in public, right? For some European country, and a copy of the ID document. So let's look at a special category. And we mentioned before, the racial or ethnic origin, political opinions or trade union membership, religious or philosophical beliefs, information about health or sex life, information related to crime or alleged crime, genetic data, biometric data. These are special categories of personal data, and you should not log them. And if you want to log them, you must have very good reasons to include such data, as we mentioned. And so in the regulation, it's basically saying processing of these data are prohibited unless there are certain conditions apply. And also, certain conditions, for example, is for public safety, also for save lives. And that's and some other conditions. In general, you should avoid logging any of these data. And in addition, if you have to log, you will need explicit consent. What can be logged? So logs may include personal data, except the sensitive data we listed in the previous slides, as long as the need can be justified. Okay, for example, the data, we collect this data that's necessary to accomplish the purpose for which the log are generated by my application, is for its operation. In order to provide this service, I have to log, let's see, the user ID. I have to log certain data, and I may have to log the IP address, so my response to go back to where it came from, right? And so just be careful, and that you want to make sure you can justify the need. That's the important part. And the log personal data could trigger the rights of the individuals. It will depend on what you're logging, and if or not, you can justify how you justify the need. Plus, if we log personal data, we have to be compliant with the data protection principles, which we also talked before. So in general, we want to basically do not log personal data unless it is necessary. And if you do log, be compliant with the data protection principles. So it's regardless what personal data you log, you want the personal data have to be protected. And as we know, improper protection will leak the data, and it can have cause many problems, both the personal problems like identity theft and identity fraud, and also financial pains, and also cause suffering for organizations. Just think about all the big breaches. So that's the organization themselves. Think about Equifax, and just hundreds of millions of users' personal information are leaked, right? And that will has great loss actually for all the organizations. So it's like you protect your personal data and in your database. Similarly for your logs, if they have personal data, you really have to protect them. So in general, you have to protect your logs, especially the logs with personal data. You want to protect for its confidentiality, right? Protect it from disclosure to unauthorized person, right? And protect its integrity, its availability, and authenticity. And so you really want to protect your logs. And so the level of protection, how much protection do you need to put onto your logs? That could depend what are sensitive, what kind of data you have in your log. And also it could depend on your hosting infrastructure, right? So it's really depend. And I'm going to talk about what we do, and with Talos DIS /Gemalto, and that you might do it differently. It's really depend on your situation. Okay. So what we do within Thales DIS, in order to build a personal data protection framework, and in order to implement privacy by design, we classify personal data into different levels based on the impact if this personal data is disclosed. Okay, so the level high is the confidentiality breach could cause serious harm to individuals. So that's, for that data we'll consider high, and we'll have examples later on. So it could cause physical, social, or financial harm, resulting to potential loss of life, loss of livelihood, and or inappropriate detention, physical personal detention. And the medium is the confidentiality breach could cause moderate harm to individuals. For example, financial loss due to identity theft or denial of benefits, and public humiliation, and so on and so forth. And the low level is the confidentiality breach would not cause individual harm more than inconvenience. For example, someone still, for example, your email is leaked out, and you will need to change to a different email address. Okay, so again, this is what we do within Thales DIS, and you should have your own classification. Like this morning, Tanya was giving a talk. She also mentioned about the data classification, and that as we all know, security has a cost. You don't have to apply the same level of security to all your data. So what you really want to do is to classify your data and apply security protection properly. So with log is similar as with your other data that you're holding in your database. And here are some examples we have. For example, for individual IDs like social security number and driver license, state ID, passport ID, and so on and so forth. These we classified as high, and also special categories of data, as we mentioned earlier. High and financial information. Yeah, financial information, you also have to have PCI compliance and other things. So card holder data is credit card data, and the payment history, bank account number, these are all highs. And then the location data, for example, your physical location, your address, GPS location, IP address, and the indirect identifiers like public key, like password, your cookies, your tokens, JSON token. And so these are classified as medium. And then direct identifiers like name, email address, username for normal end user login, and public login IDs. These are classified as low. Again, this is how we do it. You may do it differently. You might have more levels, right? You may have a critical and high. You may have 4 levels, right? So this is example, right? So and then when you do apply security, you want to protect the data. You want to consider your data classification. You want to consider the security level of your infrastructure. For this, the second bullet, each companies are different. In our case, we have applications that deployed into enterprise. We also provide cloud services. And then you use cloud providers. We also have mixed hybrid applications, which part of it in our own data center and part of it in the cloud. So it's really depend on the infrastructure. You have to consider what is the security level of your infrastructure. So for example, we treat our own data center, the security level is different from if it's running in the cloud. You want to consider the data in transit and the data at rest, okay? And another thing we do is before all this GDPR thing, and we do have data protection in general. So we have general data protection policies, and then we classify the data as there's public data, right? We're not considering that part. We consider the company private and company restricted and the company secret, confidential, company confidential. Okay, let's see, we have 3 levels. And then what we have classified the personal data, and then we map into our original data protection framework. For example, we have the low will map to our private, company private, the medium would map to restricted, the high would map to confidential, right? And in this way, your previous data protection framework can still apply to personal data and apply to log. So your logs, that's another thing we discussed before. I mean, within our company, your logs may contain different personal data, which may fall into different categories of the classification. In this case, your log stream should be protected at highest level, that is highest data classification level, and should be protected, at that level, considered the highest one. So that, again, that's what we do, and that you can design your own protection framework. Let me talk briefly on production logs. You want to store production logs securely, that's the obvious. Regardless, I want to mention, regardless of the personal data classification level, and you do not want to make those data publicly accessible. That's, even if it's low, it should still be protected. And you want to protect logs from unauthorized access. We know the logs may contain personal data. It may contain other sensitive data which may not be personal, right? Maybe the company secret or contain other things. So you want to protect logs from unauthorized access. And more specifically, you want to protect personal data in logs. There are different schemes you can do. You can anonymize. So the question is, do you really need to know this individual, or you just want to count as one person, right? So if the latter case, you want to anonymize, or you want to mask, that's like we enter password, you have ****, right? And you can use whatever mask to mask the personal data. You can hash it, you can tokenize it, or you can encrypt. So use different ways to protect your personal data. Another thing is do not use debug or trace log level in production. So as we know, the log has different log levels. So the debug or trace gives you the maximum information about your application. It could log everything in plain, the username, password, the headers, and everything. So in production, you should avoid to use debug and the trace level. Do not set it as default. In your development environment, you may have debug or trace level set as default because you are developing it, you want to debug it, right? And remember to turn it off and to change it to error or warning, change to a different level. in certain situations, I have developer ask me, right? In certain situations, let's see, a credit card doesn't work, and a credit card transaction does not go through. And then, but the application is deployed on the bank, on the customer side. It's not on our side, and we can't troubleshooting. In these certain situations, you have to log all the details so our support team can debug. Then we said, well, do not have debug or trace log in production. But in certain situations, you will have to do it in order to forensics or troubleshooting. In that case, you can turn on temporarily. As soon as your need is fulfilled, you should turn it back off. Protect logs in transit. Yeah, so this, I think this is a security conference. Use secure communication channels, for example, TLS, and make sure you authenticate the endpoints. So typically, if you have machine running in DMZ or running in less secure environment, you have logs, you really want to send it off, stream it off to a more secure environment. But you want to know your endpoint. You know you are sending to the right place. On the receiving end, you also want to make sure it's the right party you are expecting. So that's what we need authentication. The last point I want to make sure is we define a log retention policy. Remember, as we said with GDPR, you can only keep the data as long as necessary, right? That's what we relate to a log retention policy. So personal data in logs may be retained for the duration of agreement with customer. For example, the customer has signed up a 3-year contract with us, and then in the logs, we may have personal data. Of course, we have to get it protected. And so we can retain it in the duration of the customer. So now the retention, the usefulness of the log data should use to decide the duration of the retention. So you may have some regulations, some compliance rules that requires you to keep log longer than the contract with your customer. So you do want to explicitly define it. For example, with PCI DSS compliance, there's a certain period you need to keep the logs for audit purposes. And so that will help you to define the retention period. And then eliminate personal data at the end of the retention period. You don't want to keep the personal data more than you need. Right? If you keep the personal data, you are bearing the risk of potential violation of the regulations. Okay, so summary, do not log personal data unless it is necessary. And if you have to log, be compliant with GDPR and protect the data. That's all I have. I want to give special thanks to Mr. Jean-Pierre Mistral. He's our privacy lawyer, and he provided a lot of advice for me to prepare this talk and help us to provide developer guidelines. Thank you.